Hey there, good morning, Mission High School students. This morning we're continuing our series, Happy Easter. And today we're going to talk about a topic that I think in this present season that we're in, maybe the most important one that we've heard so far in this series. Today's topic is going to talk about loneliness. And I know for me personally, I'm feeling the weight of this extended quarantine season and feeling a sense of loneliness. I miss being around my friends in person, and I'm sure that you can relate that there's just something that's different when you're face to face in the same room with somebody doing something together that's totally kind of lost, even when you're trying to connect through FaceTime and Zoom and some of these other things. And so today we're going to talk about what does it look like in the midst of that loneliness for God to be present, and what does he actually want to do in us and through us in this season right now. So thanks for tuning in, and then be sure and join us tonight for Live at 5. I'm really excited to share with you something fun that we're going to be doing for Easter and some exciting news related to that, as well as to give you space to connect in your small groups. And even though our small groups are in a little bit of a different rhythm right now, I'm believing that God's going to do something special through our time together this evening. So check out this short video and then join us this evening, 5 p.m. here on YouTube for Live at 5, followed by small groups.
Easter, a time for fake grass, plastic eggs, these things, chocolate bunnies, and people dressed as bunnies. And then there are the weird parts of Easter, like fake grass, plastic eggs, these things, chocolate bunnies, and people dressed as bunnies, which is interesting. But what does all this stuff have to do with Easter? And if this holiday is about more than candy and wearing uncomfortable clothes to church and lunch with your relatives, what makes Easter happy?
Hey everyone, my name is Emily. Is there anyone in here who actually likes Peeps? Likes Peeps? You know those little so-called marshmallow chicks and bunnies that show up every Easter? This might just be me, but those things do not bring me a lot of Easter happiness. I seriously gag at the sight of them, and feeling the texture of them is even worse. Despite how I feel about them, for some reason grocery stores load up with them around Easter time. It's like a bunch of Peep-themed haunted houses. And what's crazy is the week after Easter, you see people rush to the store because they're half off. Seriously? What do you even do with that many Peeps? Every year around this time, I feel like I'm in a personal war against Peeps, especially because everyone in my house loves them. Meanwhile, Peeps are taking over my pantry, causing me to turn against my family. Why? Because I'm the only one who sees how disgusting these creatures are. Okay, maybe I'm being a little dramatic. Peeps have never caused me to turn against my family. Peeps have never made me feel all alone and on my own. But there are some things in life that have made me feel like I'm on my own. I bet you could think of a few yourself. When I was a kid, my parents moved our family across the country because of a job change. I started in a new school, moved into a new house, and moved away from the only friends I had, all within a couple of weeks. Thankfully, I was only 10 when this happened, and I adapted pretty quickly to the change. But there was a definite feeling of loneliness there for a while. And that wasn't the only time I've felt that. Whether I was on my own, making certain decisions, standing by certain beliefs, or dealing with doubts and fears and feeling like I was the only one who had them, I have definitely had seasons of feeling alone. At this point in your life, I'm sure you have too. Maybe it was because your family moved, your friend group changed, or you lost a friend, a breakup, certain decisions that no one else seemed to understand, a question, feeling, or doubt that you had and you felt like nobody understood you, especially your parents. I think we all know what it feels like to be on our own. And this is different than experiencing independence or freedom, isn't it? This on your own feeling is more like loneliness, fear, uncertainty, and anxiety all wrapped up into one. And when we feel like we're on our own, we start to believe things that seem to be true in the moment but generally aren't. Maybe we think that nobody understands us and probably never will, or that we'll never get through what we're facing, or that we don't have enough strength to make it on our own. Or we become more afraid and isolation only intensifies it. Here's what's tough about loneliness. Statistically speaking, almost half of Americans feel alone. Now, I have to admit, sometimes being alone is cool. I'm an introvert, so I can spend long periods of time on my own and really enjoy it. But there's a difference between being alone and feeling alone, isn't there? There's a difference between alone and lonely. And when it comes to loneliness, our generation is flooded with it. And that sense of loneliness has contributed to a rise in things like anxiety, self-harm, depression, even suicide in our culture. Why? Because loneliness tends to make us feel hopeless. Think about it. When we feel alone, we tend to feel overwhelmed by our situations, our circumstances, our feelings, our pain, or our confusion. And here's what's crazy about that. Loneliness feels so bad because I don't think God wired us that way. I'm saying we were created and wired for close relationships. You and I were never meant to carry the weight of what we feel, experience, or worry about on our own. And so it makes sense that when we don't have that, when we don't have what we were created for, things don't feel right to us. But what should we do about it? Sure, showing up for friends is important. Joining a small group is important. But there are times when being alone and even feeling alone is just an unavoidable part of life. So how do we handle it? Well, believe it or not, what happened the very first Easter and in the days following can be a game changer for us when it comes to this seemingly overwhelming problem. The very first Easter, Jesus' closest friends felt overwhelmed in a similar way. For years, they had been traveling together, doing life together, hanging out every day with Jesus. Suddenly, they were completely on their own. At least that's what they thought for a couple days between Jesus' death and resurrection. While we don't spend a lot of time at Easter thinking about the time between Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, I can guarantee you that his closest friends, disciples, and followers never forgot how difficult those days felt. You see, Jesus' closest friends and followers had walked away from jobs, family members, finances, and safety just to follow him. And then he died. The future they imagined for their leader, their country, and themselves disappeared. Just like that, everything changed. So what did they do? Some stuck together, but many of them ran for their lives or hid from the people who killed Jesus. They had no clue what was going to happen next. We know how the story ends, but at the time, they didn't. So imagine their surprise and relief at seeing Jesus alive again. That is, until Jesus left again. Yes, you heard me right. Jesus died, came back to life, and then left again. But this time, their response was completely different. One of the ways we know what happened with Jesus is a document written down by a doctor named Luke, who investigated the whole thing. In fact, there's a second document where Luke recorded exactly what happened with the Jesus followers after Jesus died and came back to life. He recorded their acts, and so we call that document the Book of Acts, even though it's more like a letter than a book. According to Luke, when Jesus left a second time, his followers didn't seem to think that they'd be left alone again. In fact, it wasn't until after Jesus left a second time that Christianity really took off and began to change human history forever. We'll get to the rest of what Luke said, but before we do, I want to look at another document written by one of Jesus' good friends, John. John remembers that before Jesus was crucified, he told his disciples that he was going away, but they didn't get it at the time. This is what he said in the final meal with his disciples before he was arrested. But in fact, it is best for you that I go away. Jesus actually told his disciples that it would be better for them if he left. But why? Well, Jesus continues, because if I don't, the advocate won't come. If I do go away, then I will send him to you. Jesus said that in order for the advocate to come, he had to go. The term advocate usually refers to someone who helps, comforts, and defends others. And the same is true here. This advocate Jesus is referring to is what we call the Holy Spirit. It's basically the Spirit of Jesus among us, even though he's not physically present. He is the one who helps us, comforts us, and gives us wisdom and power beyond ourselves. The Holy Spirit came to earth after Jesus left the earth. Jesus promised that if he left, it would be better for us. Why? Because the Holy Spirit would be there. And once the Holy Spirit arrived, the power and spirit of Jesus could be everywhere, not just in Jesus. And so right before Jesus ascends into heaven and leaves for the second time, he reminds his disciples of what he said during the last meal they had together before he was killed. Yes, his physical body was leaving, but his spirit would remain behind. Check it out. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere. In Jerusalem, throughout Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." Of all the things Jesus could have reminded his disciples of, he chose to remind them that the Holy Spirit was on the way. The Holy Spirit would come and give them power to tell people all over the world about him. In other words, it was a reminder that even though he was leaving, they wouldn't be alone. And guess what? It's exactly what happened. In the days and years to come, Jesus' followers would receive the power of the Holy Spirit to tell people all over the world about him. And today, roughly 1/3 of Earth's population says they believe that message. The Christian movement, started by Jesus and carried on by his first disciples, outlasted things like the powerful Roman Empire, intense persecution from governments and other religions, and then just thousands of years of change. The men and women who Jesus left twice started the greatest movement in human history. Even when their leaders seemingly left, even with their overwhelming lack of resources, even with their perceived powerlessness in the face of the authorities of the day, the Holy Spirit gave them power, even though they seemed powerless. And even though Jesus left, he sent the Holy Spirit to be with them. That meant that even though Jesus wasn't physically there, they would never be alone. Here's the best part about all of this. Jesus' promise was not just for his first disciples. When Jesus promised an advocate who would give us power and be with us, that was true for everyone who would ever believe in him. That means that you and I have access to that very same Spirit. See, Easter is so much bigger than a celebration of something that happened 2,000 years ago. Yes, Jesus' resurrection changed everything, and the resurrection is the center of everything we believe as Christians. But it's also a reminder of his power and presence that are still available to us today. Easter can change everything about how we live our lives right now because of this simple truth. Easter means you're never alone. Jesus' first followers knew what it was like to feel like they were on their own. After he died, it seemed like all their hopes were crushed. They may have even felt like they made a huge mistake by following him. And while I can imagine they loved seeing him come back to life, they were probably surprised when he didn't stay with them. They probably wondered how Jesus not being physically with them could be a good thing. But soon they learned that it was. He left something behind. Actually, he left someone behind, an advocate, his Spirit, which reminded them that they'd never be alone. What if you and I could live with the same assurance and confidence that they did after receiving the Holy Spirit? What if no matter how lonely, how overwhelmed, or misunderstood we felt, we could trust that we're never alone? Let me ask it more directly. What if this is real? What if the literal, actual God who created everything and died and rose again is literally always with you? What if the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Jesus, is very real, very here, and wants to help you with whatever you're facing today? See, simply trusting that the Holy Spirit is with us can change everything for us. In fact, even though we can't see him and may not always feel like he's there, knowing he is with us in the moments we feel on our own means that we can be confident about a couple of things. First, you can talk to him anytime, any place, for any reason. When you feel alone, what if you chose to talk to God about what you're going through? In the New Testament, we learn that the Holy Spirit helps us talk to God when we don't know what to say. What if the next time you felt like you were on your own, you chose to talk to God about what you're facing or feeling? What would happen if you chose to believe that he hears you and his Spirit is at work in ways that you can't see? Second, you're stronger than you think you are. The odds were stacked against Jesus' first followers. Jesus wasn't there. They were underqualified. The Romans were incredibly powerful. Yet, the movement they carried forward has forever changed the world. That's because they knew that they were stronger than they seemed. They knew that even though it looked like they were on their own, they had God's power flowing in and through their lives. The same is true for you and I. When we face challenges that seem too overwhelming for us, we can be confident that the Holy Spirit's power in us cannot be overcome. We can also be confident that God's power in other believers will be there to support us too. You might feel like what you're facing is too powerful for you. And that may be true, but it is not too powerful for the one that is in you and other Jesus followers around you. Remember, Easter means you're never alone. The power of Easter is that Jesus enabled us to be confident that we'll never be alone again. Why? Because we trust in His Spirit that lives inside of us. In a day and age where so many of us are lonely, this might be the happiest news we've heard in a while. As you head out today, I want you to think about this question. In what area of my life do I feel alone? Then imagine Jesus, the same Jesus who loves you and died for you, looking you in the eyes and saying, you're not on your own here. We're in this together. Maybe the best news you'll hear this week is you don't have to imagine this. The Holy Spirit makes it a reality, and that's why Easter is so very happy.